officially open.
Welcome to draft season. We are back for the 2024 college and pro football season. John Schmeelk, Tony Pauline. We're still brought to you by Moody's. And every year we like to lead off our season with the man who comes out with, I'll call it the best list on all of sports. It's the annual Freaks List from Bruce Feldman. You can find it on The Athletic. You can also see him on TV covering college football for Fox. Bruce, you got John Schmeelk and Tony Pauline with you. We're all about to get started here. This is airing the Monday after we have our little fake college football weekend before the big college football weekend. And it's time for the sprint, my friend. Are you ready to go?
I am. I love this time of year, especially because we don't ourselves actually have to go sit in a classroom and go to school. That was like the bittersweet part of this time of year was like, I love that football was around the corner. I didn't love that I had to go get new clothes and get ready for the classroom. But now, just as a grown-up, quote unquote, I love it.
Bruce, what's the first game you're going to be attending this year?
Tony, the first game I have is we go to West Virginia for Penn State, West Virginia. So we have a good slate that we know our first three games. It's that game in Morgantown. Then week 2, we're in Ann Arbor for Texas at Michigan. And then week 3, Alabama at Wisconsin. So can't wait.
And that Texas-Michigan game is going to be huge, not only from a scouting perspective, but a national title perspective. It's going to be a big challenge for the new head coach who basically met every challenge that he was presented with last year.
Yeah, I mean, look, they're going to be really good, I think, on defense. Again, they got playmakers on the front end and the back end with Will Johnson, but then they're going to get Quinn Ewers, who will be an interesting prospect for everybody to check out. He's played a lot now. He has really good receivers. They're different receivers because, he had 2 high draft picks with speed, and now they bring in a bunch of guys from the portal, including 2 who are almost as fast as Xavier Worthy. Not quite, one's smaller, but like they should be pretty dynamic, and they have a good offensive line. So I think that's
a good offensive line.
Yeah, so why don't we jump into the Freaks List, Bruce? You mentioned, you have Penn State, Virginia Tech, your first game. You got a bunch of guys from both schools on this Freaks List. We'll get to some of those. But first, I feel like the list really reflects, when you take a look at what this draft 9 months from now might look like, it's reflected in your list. There's a lot of guys up front on defense, especially on the edge, that populates your list.
Yeah, I mean, and I felt like that was kind of, I don't want to say it's cyclical, but you do get a little, last year, obviously, Latu was a great player. He was out here on the West Coast, where I live, and was just an elite technician and, had a really interesting backstory. Obviously, Dallas Turner was an explosive guy at Alabama, but you didn't really have what I think now is there's just a lot of dudes that are coming up, and not just edge guys, but there's a lot of, I alluded to Kenneth Grant from Michigan. I mean, they've had a bunch of freaky D linemen, going back, Rashawn Gary's from back where you guys are, New Jersey kid. He started it. You obviously had Aiden Hutchinson in there. I mean, Kenneth Grant's 350. And the way those coaches talk about him, and those coaches have been there for this whole run. He is, I have some video on the Freaks List, with the story on The Athletic where people can look and see just how he moves at that size. I mean, there's a play, they play Penn State, and he runs down Katron Allen, who's a good back, and he runs him down 30 yards downfield. I mean, this is a guy who's 350, not 250. And I don't want to say there's a lot of other guys like that, but, they have another one, Mason Graham is a big time player. And there's just a lot of, Ohio State had 2 terrific defensive ends who decided to come back. They could have put their names in the draft, JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer. Those guys are really, really good players. But, Ohio State stepped up, and the NIL is a little different now than it probably was, what that equation was like for guys who maybe they can come out and be top 50 picks, but if they stay another year, maybe they can be top 20 picks.
Yeah, and it's funny because, Grant Smith, you talk about him, Kenneth Grant, I should say, you could see that athleticism up, Phil. I mean, you could see the way he moves. And everybody talks about Mason Graham. And the way I like to present it now is Mason Graham is the better football player today, but 2 or 3 years down the road, Kenneth Grant has the ability to be the much more dynamic, much more dominant player because of that size, because of that athleticism, and because of the fact that he, if he does the little things well, will just become a better football player.
Yeah, and I think when you see it, I mean, Mason Graham's a really like if he was someplace else, I think that the explosiveness and some of the stuff that would get him on the freaks list would probably show up more. It's just like you have this other guy who's like the freak of all freaks in there at that size. But yeah, I mean, you're talking about. I mean, this is going to be really interesting because obviously you have a defense coordinator. A lot of NFL people know, and Wink Martindale goes there. They've had a lot of turnover, and I want to say it's in a good way because you go from Mike McDonald, who Jim Harbaugh had a great hire there, and then Jesse Minter. And now both those guys, one guy's a head coach in the NFL, the other guy's a defense coordinator with the Chargers. And what he inherits is those two big guys. Josiah Stewart is another edge guy who the people inside Michigan are really raving about. He was at Coastal Carolina, was really productive. Then he was a rotational guy last year. They have Will Johnson, who was the MVP of the national title game at corner. He's a big corner. And super smart. People love his intangibles. I don't know if he's going to run in the 4.3s, but everybody who's worked with him can't say enough good things about him. So you have like that defense, I think, is going to be really interesting to watch this year.
You mentioned Will Johnson. He could be a top 10 pick. The two tackles from Michigan could be top 10 picks. They're all three guys you mentioned in your article on The Athletic. Surprisingly, though, and maybe this has to do with how the list gets put together, not a ton of Ohio State guys on your list. You have their guard, right? He's on there. Their linebacker, Styles, is on there. But I feel like there were probably a little bit more representation for Michigan.
Smith is on. Yeah, Jeremiah Smith.
And of course, Jeremiah Smith, who I was going to ask about you at the end, who a lot of people think is going to be maybe one of the best college wide receivers they've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, Jeremiah, the people inside Ohio State now are trying to be cautious about what they're seeing and not get like the hype is already pretty crazy around him. I mean, people who've been in recruiting a long time in South Florida say he's the most talented receiver they've ever seen out of there. And if you think of the receivers who come through there, one of them just went in the Hall of Fame a couple of weeks ago, Andre Johnson. And so now again, Jeremiah Smith was probably more polished than a lot of those guys coming out of high school, but he's 6'3", he's almost 220, and his strength numbers are crazy. He's almost an 11-foot broad jump guy. Marvin Harrison Jr. is obviously an elite talent and really polished. And this guy's stronger, more top end. And I mean, he's stronger now than coming right out of high school. So he's really special. But yeah, I think with Ohio State, those guys are really good football players. They're a little, the ones, we're talking about, a little like what Tony was saying with Mason Graham. I mean, Jack Sawyer is really, really good. Really, they're talking about a really complete guy. I don't know if he's as twitchy as some of the other edge guys, but it was also, these are not small guys out there either. The two guys who had like the crazy get off numbers and last year, one guy was at Penn State and the other guy was Dallas Turner. I mean, one's like 248, the other one's like 254. They're not 270, right? And so I think that's a little, different math there when you're seeing a guy who's around 250 compared to a guy who's that much bigger and probably won't put up quite as eye-popping numbers in the combine part of it.
Go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I mean, just since we're talking about Ohio State, Donovan Jackson is on your list, the offensive guard, and it's probably a good thing that he went back because, a year ago at this time, people talking about a day 2 pick. Some people said he could maybe slide into the late part of round 1. Did not have a good year. I mean, that Ohio State offensive line last year was up and down, and I think Donovan Jackson was a little bit more down. But as you mentioned in your, as he's on your freaks list, he has that innate ability to be a real good, college guard and then project to being an NFL prospect.
Yeah, I mean, he was a huge recruit coming out of high school. He was ID'd that way early on, and he's played a lot. You remember when he was in there, you had two offensive tackles who, both high-level prospects, right? And he was the other guy you would notice. And then I think around him, and again, so much offensive line is a cohesiveness of how it kind of the parts work together. I mean, so they had uncertainty at center. You had the offensive tackles were really inconsistent, for lack of a better term. The most talented one they probably had last year was a transfer from San Diego State who had some good moments and some not so great moments. I just think, for a team that was undefeated going into the Michigan game, there was still, like, I mean, Travion Henderson to me, the running back, is like got some wow traits to him as a running back. But I just think there was a lot of times where, is he going to be healthy to play? There was just a lot of parts of it. You didn't have, CJ Stroud obviously is a fantastic quarterback, but then they went, the quarterback was a question mark, right? I mean, it was just everything felt a little off at Ohio State last year. It just felt a little, and now we see a staff shakeup, and obviously Chip Kelly comes in there to run the offense. He's really good in the run game, and I think that mentality, combined, he knows the two O-line guys he's working with because they, both worked with him at UCLA, and Justin Fry, who is, has been a good O-line coach. But I think now, there's probably everybody is going to be more on the same page with what the identity is. Because I felt like last year, they didn't seem like they really had a comfort in what their identity was. Because I think so many you lose both offensive tackles, you lose I don't know if we can call CJ a generational quarterback, but I mean, because they've had so many great quarterbacks, but he was special. And I just think they were just a little off. And maybe that this year for Donovan Jackson, you'll see him kind of settle into being the leader and to being an All-American kind of guy.
And we should know.
Just to stay on Ohio State, C.J. Stroud was generational when you compare him to Colin McCord. You're pretty sure from a college football question, Will Howard's going to win that? Is going to be that starting quarterback this year at Ohio State?
Yeah, from what I've heard, there's real good optimism about him. He's a better athlete than I think a lot of people outside realized. I mean, there were some long runs he had at K-State. Talking to Chip Kelly, he was like, this guy is a 22 mile per hour guy that they've tracked on GPS. He's actually faster than some of the guys who people thought were faster than him. And again, I don't think they're asking him. CJ's arm is special, and I don't think they're asking him to try to do that. And I don't think Chip Kelly, especially running the offense, he wants to run the football. And I think that's going to help them identity-wise because, Ohio State felt different than everybody else in the Big Ten. And for a long time, that was a good thing because they were so explosive. But I think last year it felt like it was a little bit, there was another side of it where it was just kind of like the run game was just kind of missing a little bit. And I think that'll be back. And I think that'll really help. And I think, look, they have two big time running backs, not just Henderson now. Yeah. Quinshon Judkins comes from Ole Miss, and he's got a lot of juice. I mean, that's a scary 1-2 punch there.
Yeah, especially Judkins in that Chip Kelly running game. That could be scary. And just so draft fans and NFL people, Jeremiah Smith not draft eligible for another 3 years, guys. So you're going to have to wait for him. You mentioned Will Johnson, the cornerback out of Michigan already. Bruce, he's a guy that I think people think it could be a top 10 pick. Another guy who's kind of a cornerback that's at the top of your freaks list, number 2, in fact, is Travis Hunter, the cornerback / wide receiver out of Colorado. And I think it was interesting in your write-up of him. It's not just his testing numbers and his physical traits that's impressive, is that he's still testing on the field GPS-wise at these numbers, even though he's playing 100 snaps per game.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy because last year, our first game was TCU, was coming off playing the national title game, was hosting CU. A lot of curiosity. It is hot down there in Texas, especially in, whatever is August 30th or whatever that date was. It's 100 degrees. He played 140 snaps in that game, 140. And he made 2 plays in the second half. And it was the real analytics folks who have, who track a lot of this stuff. The numbers that he, in terms of his closing speed on 2 separate plays. One, he makes this diving red zone interception where his break on the ball is exceptional. The other one where he runs down a running back 60 yards downfield. It's the gas tank he has. It's one thing to be on the field. It's another thing to be on the field and making those kind of plays after it's not just being in the game for 2 hours. It's being on both sides of the ball. It's kind of unprecedented. I have to go back. Chris Gamble was a really good 2-way player at Ohio State. This is, almost 20 years ago now. I feel weird saying it's almost 20 years. Obviously people remember Charles Woodson winning a Heisman, Champ Bailey. Those guys were those two were really spectacular. But the workload that Travis Hunter is doing is insane. Hey, also 4.0 student, credit to him for that. I'm interested to see if he is a 3-and-out guy, and obviously his first year was at Jackson State, and then he'll have 2 at CU. What he's evaluated coming in the process. Obviously, Deion Sanders knows cornerbacks better than anybody, but he, everything you see from him, because he was a 5-star, number one ranked player coming out of high school and chose to go to FCS to play for Deion at Jackson State. It wasn't like there's plays where there's another guy on the freaks list, Tedero McMillan, guy with unbelievable ball skills out of Arizona, he could be a 3-and-out. There's plays where he gets a touchdown on, Travis. Like there's going to be times where somebody, gets him. But again, just the workload is insane. I mean, do people say, all right, he's probably much better at a cornerback than he is as a receiver? I don't know.
Moody's is a proud partner of the New York Giants. Decode risk, unlock opportunity. Visit Moody's.com.
I want to go a little bit deeper into your top 10. We talked about Kenneth Grant. We've got two guys I believe both are super seniors, Derek Van of North Carolina State and Jordan Birch of Oregon, who started his career with South Carolina. There are different types of guys. I mean, Van is a guy who just makes play after play after play. When you look at him from an NFL prospect point of view, what position is he going to play? 6'1.5", 270. He makes plays. Is he a defensive end? Is he a 3 technique guy? And then you got Jordan Burke, 6'4.5", 280 plus pounds, outstanding athlete, makes some wild plays. And this is a guy that if he really pulls it together, and you mentioned this in this article, the coaches expect a breakout year. This is a guy who right now is graded as a day 3 pick that could make a big march up draft boards.
Yeah, when I talked to Dan Lanning, the coach there, and he had come from Georgia, he'd been at Alabama, so he's seen, elite front guys. He just talked about how it feels like the light has more come on. And if he was a freaks list guy last year. It wasn't like he was a slouch. I mean, he's been productive at times, but it's like, and again, he was a 5-star guy coming out of high school, went to South Carolina. I remember Ed Ogeron, the old LSU coach, and he's been around more big time D lineman than any coach I know. He was like, this is the most talented defensive lineman in the country. And then I remember he went to South Carolina and he was good, but he was not like, oh, this guy's going to be a top 10 pick someday. This might be the breakthrough year for him. Again, the way Dan Lanning was talking about in terms of his conditioning, in terms of like, it seems like the attention to detail. He has a chance. Of the two of them, I feel like no one really questions Davin Van's motor. He was an elite wrestler and he was a track guy. He's just, if he was 30 pounds bigger, is he
2 inches taller?
Yeah, is he trying to be in that Aaron Donald, Kalijah Cansey mode? But he's not. He's smaller. He might be a little bit of a tweener, but I think he's the third down guy where they move him inside and he causes all kinds of havoc. I mean, he's a really good player at NC State. I don't know. I'd be curious how high he could go in the draft. Whereas if Birch does what Dan Lanning thinks, Birch could be a top 10 pick. There's nothing stopping him from being, I mean, he's almost 300 pounds. He's almost 6'5". He can move he's really explosive. I think there's also a lot of position flexibility with him, depending on where he is weight wise. You had a really good defensive lineman from Mizzou. I don't want to say, relatively similar size. Now that kid, everybody loved in meetings and, was just kind of, I think, loved the intangible piece of it. Whereas Birch, I'm not saying they won't, but Birch is, I think, an even better athlete than Robinson was. So it will be interesting to see because there's high expectations for this Oregon team this year. I mean, they should be one of the 3 best teams in the country this year. And if Birch takes another big step forward, they could win a national title. I really believe that because he's as talented as any D lineman out there.
I want to stick in your top 10, Bruce, real quick. A guy that I had never heard of until I read him in your top 10. Kamari Copeland. I love the story. Iowa Community College out there. Went to Army too, wound up in Virginia Tech, 6'3", 280. And I feel like this is a guy that could explode on the scene if everything goes right for him at Va Tech.
Yeah, and there are a bunch of freaks in Blacksburg right now. I had 3. I could have had probably 5 guys on there. And this one is insanely strong, but he also is like a 20-mile-per-hour GPS guy. It's funny, one of the other freaks guys I had on there had DM'd me and he was like, you got to put Kamari because they knew each other from that junior college in Iowa. And so people know about him. I mean, again, he was at West Point, then he went to junior college. I expect he will be a really big force for them in the middle of the defense for the Hokies. I mean, Brent Pry has had a lot of really good front seven guys back when he was at Penn State. I'm interested to see, just like, again, there's good buzz about him, and now it's like, okay, how does it translate, in the ACC level where there are a bunch of really, there's a lot of good D linemen there. I mean, obviously Clemson had a run of them. Florida State now has, I mean, a couple of really, I had two defensive tackles high up on my freaks list this year. Miami has a bunch of dudes in the D line now, especially some of the younger guys they have. And you mentioned NC State and Van. Now this other guy, though, I think I want to see what it looks like with him this year in terms of making the leap from junior college into really being in a role where I think they're counting on him to be a very disruptive player.
Want to talk right outside the top 10, number 11, Nick Emanwari of South Carolina. When you watch the South Carolina film, you can't not notice this guy because he's so big and he's so huge, moving sideline to sideline in center field, just blowing up plays. I mean, he is a linebacker sized defensive player in the defensive secondary.
Yeah, his numbers are crazy, Tony. I mean, it was like the numbers, like, Shane Beamer's the coach, and we were talking about, because I asked him, because Nick Harbor's my number one guy. He's an elite track guy, and he's also a supersized receiver. And so I asked him about Nick, and I was like, these numbers are insane that somebody had sent me about him. 11.4 broad jump, 42-inch vertical, also 24 reps at 225. For a linebacker, that's good now. For a safety, that's insane. He's almost 230 pounds. The other thing he's productive. He's only been there 2 years. He's still only 20 years old. I don't know what he projects like in the NFL, but like those traits now at 20 years old, those numbers are remarkable. And again, he's in the SEC. He is not he's not doing it at a smaller conference where he is, big boying like moderately talented guys. I mean, he's doing this in the SEC, and I feel like more people should be talking about him. You don't see this kind of production with this kind of size and this kind of athleticism in the SEC, and not people aren't, raving about him. He's bigger than Harold Perkins is, right? And Harold Perkins had huge, reputation coming out of 2 years ago, out of his freshman year. And I'm not saying he's not an elite player, because he is, but I'm just more people. I think it's because this team, didn't go to a bowl game last year that it was just kind of like, okay, whatever.
Penn State is like an edge factory, Bruce. Every year, it's Chop Robinson, it's Adafe Owe a couple years before that. They just churn out these super athletic edge guys. And now you have Abdul Carter, a couple other guys from Penn State here. Looks like the Nittany Lions are once again just churning out those guys on the edge up front on defense.
Yeah, and it's, again, they've had so many come through there, and they're all, feel like they're kind of similar in terms of like, whether it's Micah Parsons or somebody who's kind of like Micah Parsons, and you just kind of go through it. In this case, I think James Franklin has recruited a lot of big time athletes. We'll see what Abdul Carter does as he transitions, from linebacker to defensive end. I mean, people there do make some Micah Parsons comparisons. I mean, he was a guy last year that, he's about the same size as Chop, and he's running in the 4.4s, and 22, and I think it was 22.4 for GPS numbers. I mean, the reason why they were not like a top 10 team, I think, is because, last year, because the offense, when they played elite teams, just got bogged down. Franklin brought in a different offense coordinator, Andy Kotelnicki. I mean, he's got a really good rep and done a lot of really good things. We'll see how it goes from this point on. But defensively, I mean, Manny Diaz was the defense coordinator. Now he's the head coach at Duke. Tom Allen comes in. He's a really good defensive coach. I think they will be very good on defense again.
Number 16, Thor Griffith, a guy that I've watched the past couple of years at Harvard. He now takes his game to Louisville, which, if he plays well, is going to help his draft stock. He was always great as a potential 8-round pick. But you mentioned how he's 320 pounds. When you watch the film, the guy plays like a 3 technique tackle in the sense that he's quick, he's agile, he's mobile, he moves incredibly well. He's not just a big guy in the middle of the line that takes up space. This guy, Thor Griffith, he's very athletic.
He is. I mean, he was a standout wrestler in high school in New Hampshire, also was a youth hockey star. So, I mean, he's got different sports backgrounds where that athleticism kind of carries over. He is a weight room beast. I think the big key for him is now as he makes the move, just basically see it translate against much better offensive linemen, around him. And also, there's good talent around him. I mean, there's an edge rusher that Louisville has who's a big time, I think is probably I would not be surprised if he's a top 100 pick there. So I don't think, we've seen Louisville with some guys, right? Yaya Diaby a few years ago. They've had some freaky athletes, but Thor, in terms of just weight room strength and just mauling guys, I mean, that was a problem in the Ivy Leagues. We'll see, if he can do similar in the ACC.
Ashton Gillette is the other defensive end that you were mentioning from Louisville that just creates havoc. And now having a guy like Griffith play on the inside, I think is just going to make Gillette that much of a better player.
Yeah, I mean, he's a South Florida kid. He was a big time weight room kid. He's been on the freaks list before. He was a big time weight room kid coming out of like the Boca Raton area. And he's been really good. I think I'm actually surprised he has not gotten more attention given how productive he has been. Louisville last year played Florida State in the ACC title game, but I just feel like sometimes some of those ACC players, even though it's been a Power Five and now Power Four conference, unless you're at Florida State or Clemson, you tend to fly under the radar, right? Like Peyton Wilson was if he didn't have the injury history, but like going into the draft, but he was an amazing player, and
For a
and
while.
yeah, and so, again, I think Ashton is one of those guys. I'm not saying he's going to be a top 30 pick, but I think he'll test really well and he's going to make a ton of plays this year.
All right, I want to go to number 17 on your list, the guy that in a very early mock draft, some people have him as the top overall player in the class. That's James Pierce, the defensive end slash edge player out of Tennessee. Talking to the coaches there and the people around the country, is that how he's generally viewed as one of these guys that could be the first overall pick if everything goes right for him?
Maybe. I mean, he's interesting in that I talked to somebody who'd been in Knoxville, one of the scouts, just last week, and he was like, he was 208 pounds when he got there, and he was up to I think 248 when the scout was there middle of last week. I mean, he can run and run and run. The question had been just how big was he? Well, now he's almost 250 pounds. Now we'll see if he can stay there. If is he 248, at the beginning of camp, and then he ends up at 238, into the season, who knows? But no one questions. I mean, he makes a play in the bowl game there against Iowa, and it's a pick six. The GPS numbers on him were crazy. It's like, and it almost doesn't look like he's even running that fast, but they were like numbers of a top wide receiver again. And he's bigger now, but still, I think he should be in that discussion, a top 10 pick. I don't, it'll be interesting if he'd be the first pick in the draft, but he can run and he really had a breakout year last year. And I think there's a lot to like there.
Number 22 and 23, you got back-to-back receivers on opposite ends of the country, and they've got basically opposite games. You got Daquan Felton, the Norfolk State transfer, who goes back for a 6 year, who's more of your downfield, explosive, vertical threat. And then you have a player, Tatoria McMillan, who you mentioned earlier, who's the bigger, more dominant game possession possession receiver type of player. Who I think McMillan could go very early, but it's going to be Felton who I think is going to raise the eyebrows at the combine with the super fast times.
Yeah, Felton's super explosive, and it's interesting because Kyron Drones, who was a first year starter last year at quarterback, another freaky athlete. I mean, he looks like a linebacker. I remember he was at Baylor before, and I remember seeing him in warmups. He wasn't the starter, and I was like, man, that guy looks like he'd be a linebacker. And they're like, he could be anything he wants. And he's a smart kid who went in there, and they got way better as the year went on.
Yeah.
And Felton is they have some really good receivers. They had a really good receiver who started his career at Old Dominion, got hurt last year, only played like 2 games, and he's back. And they have big athletic receivers. T-Mac, if people have not seen him, I mean, he is a special player. Jed Fish told me when I was doing Freaks List, he was like, he's the biggest freak athlete I've seen. And Jed Fish has been in the NFL for a long time in coaching. His ball skills are incomparable, right? I mean, he was top level volleyball player, great basketball player. He's not quite 6'5". He's 6'4" and change, 210 pounds. And his timing, and it's just remarkable. You can watch, we talked about Travis Hunter earlier. I mean, he's got a touchdown on Travis Hunter in the red zone. There's nothing Travis Hunter can do to stop him. I mean, like, he is a special player. I don't know how fast he will time. He might be 4.49. He might be 4.55. I don't know. When I talked to one of the strength coaches who used to be there and is now at Washington, it was like he came in, he was a 19-mile-per-hour guy. Now he's like 21.9. So he's definitely progressed. He's not going to, even the film will tell you he's a 40-inch vertical jump guy. Guys who coach him like, oh yeah, his vertical's 40. He's like, no. When I talked to Tetaroa about a month ago, he was like, no, it's like up to 34 inches. And it was like 31 before. He was like, it's all my timing. People think and it's like, also, I think some of it, he's a volleyball player. So if you watch film of volleyball players spiking the ball, they have crazy ability to ascend off of like their plant foot and just, come up out of the ground. And that's not a vertical jump, right? Because it's different to run up and do it. I mean, I can't say enough that like positive things about what kind of playmaker he is. Again, I mean, they trust in him so much. I think I would say he's one of the 5 best players in college football right now.
Wow. All right. That's something to keep an eye on. You talked, Bruce, about it being cyclical with the defensive lineman in the draft. So I'm going to the running back position now. We didn't see a running back go in last year's draft until second half of round number 2 with Jonathan Brooks, and he was coming off an ACL injury. You have 2 running backs between 20 and 30. You got a couple more in your top 55, including Ashton Giante from Boise State, which I've watched. He's a lot of fun to watch. What do you think of the running backs groups on your list, and if that class is, you think, going to look a little bit better this year than it did last year?
Yeah, Nick Singleton at Penn State is definitely a size, speed kind of freaky guy. He had a more productive freshman year in 2022 than he did last year in terms of, I think he was averaging 7 yards a carry as a freshman. Then last year it was like 4.5. But again, the offense kind of bogged down, I thought, for them. He's really gifted. Ashton Genty from Boise State is a great all-around running back. I suspect as you get closer to the draft process, people are going to marvel at his all-around skills. He's really good. He's not even 21 yet, so he couldn't go to Mountain West Media Days because they had it in a casino in Vegas that you had to be at least 21 to get in. But Boise State decided to bring him separately and to get that visibility. But he's a really, really good player. Like, they could make the playoff, and it would be a big part would be because he's so special. I mean, he's a great all-around running back. And again, his numbers are really good testing wise, but he's such a great receiver, and I think he's such a complete back. He'll be fun to watch this year.
The other 2 running backs, real quick. The other 2 running backs on your list was Caden Fegan, the big guy at like 250. There were Derrick Henry comparisons in the write-up.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to butcher this, Bashul Tootin from Virginia Tech.
Yeah, Tootin's super explosive, 40-inch vertical guy, 4.32, 40. He's not nowhere near as big as Fegan. Fegan is like, when I talked to Brett Bielema, they were, talking about, they're comparing his measurables to Derrick Henry, and they match up really well in terms of what they've seen him do and what Henry did in the combine process. I mean, he is that big. And Bielema told me a story. He goes, when we were recruiting him, I told everybody in our program, do not mention one word about defense. He is a running back, because a lot of times those guys come in and hang on a second, you have to get out of the room. So when they were talking about him, it was just like, you have to make sure that he does not get the idea that we're going to switch him, because that's what everybody else is telling him, right? And so he had, there was a run he had, a catch and run earlier in the year. I want to say it was like a 50-yard run where you see that speed. He's just kind of flying and he's a huge back. I mean, he's a legit 250 plus. So I'm interested to see how his career kind of transitions there. Again, they think he could be a great anything, but they love him as a running back and they're going to ride him.
I want to talk about two players in the bottom half of the 30s that you have. Go back to the receiver. You talked about McMillan being underrated. Bo Collins. I mean, here's a guy who, for the past years, especially last year when he was on the field, did nothing but make plays after play after play at Clemson. Transfers to Notre Dame. You watch the film. Collins makes plays. You read your article on about what a freak, what a good athlete he is. You talk to NFL scouts, and they have a free agent grade on this guy. I just don't understand it.
I think some of it might have been consistency issues, maybe. Um, you know, how well did he consistently catch the ball before? It's interesting because his numbers are really, really high level, from what the coaches at Notre Dame gave me. And that's the area where they got to take a big step up. They bring in Riley Leonard, who's a really good athlete himself, the Duke quarterback, who's banged up last year, but he can run. And if Notre Dame is going to be a team that can get in the playoff and make some noise, they need somebody to emerge as a go-to, a difference maker outside. And maybe he can be it. I mean, physical tools are there. It's just, I think, the consistency to really be that guy. But there's some wow stuff there. I mean, again, they lost some good receivers, from last year, and they didn't have a lot of depth outside. I think he was a big get for them, and we'll see what he can give them this year because they really need that pass game to get going. They have an interesting week 1 game. They're going to play Mike Elko's the new coach at Texas A&M. He was the defensive coordinator there, and then he went to Duke and did terrific. He's a New Jersey guy. He knows Riley Leonard better than anybody because he was his coach at Duke the last couple of years. I think most people are assuming that Notre Dame will win that game, but that's not going to be easy.
I want to give the offensive line some love here, Bruce. You have two guys in your top 10, Jaden Roberts out of Alabama and Iowa, big surprise, developing a good center like we haven't seen that before. Logan Jones, who's just 293. There was some Linderbaum comparisons there. And then Will Campbell. I know his teammate at LSU is pretty good too, but a lot of people think Campbell, could be the first offensive lineman off the board if you want to talk about those three guys a little bit.
Yeah, Will Campbell has been as advertised. He was a huge recruit for them at LSU. And the coaches love him. They think he's the best lineman they've seen there in a long time, and he was really good last year. I don't think he's given up a sack in like a year and a half. I think if you told me he was a top 3 pick this year, it wouldn't surprise me. I really think he's that good all around, especially based on what the coaches at LSU, the way they talk about him. Jaden Roberts might be the strongest guy in college football. It's just like the strength numbers are insane for him. He's also like 18% body fat. He's in the 325-pound range. I mean, he's a really, really good football player. The third one, Iowa, as you said, I mean, whether it's Wirfs, whether it's Linderbaum, I mean, when I talk to Kirk Ferentz, who, line guy at trade, who knows it probably better than any head coach, I think, at least in college football, the thing, he just kind of was raving about Logan Jones, and he compared him to Linderbaum. And he was like, based on how he moves and how he plays, you would have thought he was a high school wrestler. He actually wasn't. He was a great all around athlete though. And the numbers for him for the last couple of years inside the Iowa strength program have been really eye popping. So I had no problem putting him in as a top 10 guy. He's not, if he's probably 10 pounds bigger, I think that would probably make him a lot more attractive right now in terms of that, because he's been more of a developmental guy, having been a D lineman and then moving over. But I think he had a good first year, and we'll see, how he progresses. He was coming off some injury in January, so some of the testing didn't happen this year. But Kirk Ferentz can't say enough good things about him.
Moody's is a proud partner of the New York Giants, uniting the brightest minds to turn today's risks into tomorrow's opportunities. Learn more at Moody's.com.
I'm going to stay on the offensive line, number 39. One of my favorite guys in the country, Armand Membo, of the right tackle for the Missouri Tigers. He's going to be guard in the NFL, but when you watch this guy, he's big. Well, he's wide. He's strong, but he also moves very well. And you talk about his numbers, not only his strength numbers, but his 10-yard time and his athletic numbers. I mean, here's a guy who's got, as far as I'm concerned, scheme versatility. At the next level, he can play guard in a power gap scheme because he's got the strength. You could also use him in his own blocking scheme because he's able to get out quickly on the second level and take linebackers out of the action.
Yeah, I mean, and they have been really excited about him for a while. Last year was a breakout year for Mizzou. They obviously finished the year. They beat Ohio State in a big bowl game, and that was huge for that program. He's going to test very well. He was a guy who had multiple, like he was, played a lot of soccer growing up, and I think you see kind of that athleticism translate. And Brandon Jones, the O-line coach, has been talking him up to me since he got there from he was the former O-line coach at Houston, and he had some really good players there. And this one, again, I agree with you. He's a guy, it may have the length to even play at right tackle. I know he's not the tallest, but there's a lot of stuff because his athleticism is so good. And they're really big believers in him as a talent because he's just a really, really smooth athlete.
You have two guys, Bruce, in your top 40 from these two programs, but you can talk about them even generally. How do you think the passing games and who might emerge from the Alabama and LSU programs this year? LSU had all the guys graduate last year. Alabama, Jermaine Burton kind of came along as they went along. He got drafted on day 2 of the NFL draft. How do you see those two passing attacks evolving and who might emerge from those groups that could be an impact in the NFL draft in April?
Yeah, first for LSU, because you obviously had the Heisman Trophy winner, and then you had 2 first-round receivers, and one of them you guys obviously are going to see a lot of or seen a lot of.
By the way, he is pretty damn special watching him every day in practice. He is unbelievable, Malik Neighbors. Holy cow.
Yeah, it's just to stay on him for 2 seconds. Like I remember doing the one of the draft articles I did where I'm talking to different receivers coaches in the NFL, and they were like, "Oh, he's number 1 on our board ahead of," and it surprised me because like Marvin Harrison Jr. was such a complete receiver, but I think people are like, yeah, he doesn't have like the juice that Neighbors has, and again, I'm sure if you asked 20 guys, they'd all 20 wouldn't have said Neighbors, obviously, but there was that kind of like wow factor to him. At LSU, so one of the guys who was a holdover from that group who came in when Neighbors came in, Chris Hilton, was a high level track guy. And I know TJ Hushmanzada out here, longtime NFL receiver, trains guys. He had Hilton, and Hilton, he was like he's running in 4.29, and you see some serious explosiveness from him. The new quarterbacks, Garrett Nussmeier, his dad, Doug, former NFL quarterback who's been in the NFL, the coach a long time now with the Eagles. He's a really talented quarterback and sling it around really good. Got a little bit of the gunslinger kind of vibe to him. So I think the biggest thing with him is taking care of the ball and not, being careful with turnovers. But he's really good. I mean, I think he has a chance to have a big, big season. They lost 2 great receivers, but as we said, and John, you referenced this before, and it's right. It's not just Will Campbell. That's a really good offensive line. They have talent on the other side of the line. They have experience. And so I think the offense is going to be really good. That's not the question mark there. I mean, Nussmeier ended up leading them to a comeback win against Wisconsin in the bowl game. I think they were down 14 and he rallied them. And that was, Neighbors wasn't in there in the second half. I mean, it was like the new guys kind of going. So I think they'll be really good. Alabama's going to be, I'm fascinated to see Kalen DeBoer comes in there. We saw he had as explosive an offense as anybody last year with Penix and those 3 receivers that he had in a really good offensive line. And now he inherits Jalen Milroe, who's super dynamic as an athlete, has a strong arm and a really good work ethic. So we'll see how that picks up. I think what they had, which was hard to kind of come off of, they had like a historic run of receivers under Nick Saban. And then, they had the 4 at one point where obviously Devontae Smith was the headliner, but the other guys were terrific too. And then last year there was it was noticeable drop off. Even Jamison Williams from before who transferred in was obviously special athletically. We'll see how it picks up. They have some young receivers. I know they're really excited, but they're really, really young.
And 2 of their best receivers transferred out. One's playing in Texas this year, Isaiah Bond. I want to go deep into your list. Ty French, now at West Virginia. I remember watching this cat when he played at Gardner Webb. And at the time, I mean, he looked like almost a safety size linebacker, the way he played, making plays all over the place, his range, the way he pursued the action. Read your article, and the athletic numbers on this guy are off the chart. And obviously, coming from Gardner Webb, who nobody watches play, no one's going to know about Ty French at West Virginia.
Yeah, was a dominant player there. Neil Brown, the head coach of West Virginia, I talked to, last night actually, and we were talking about some other guys, and we talked about him. He's like, he's a really, really good player. He's going to test great. I think they're really excited about him. I think, I wonder if in terms of the NFL side of it, will he come across as a little bit of a tweener? Now, I think tweener seems like it's more of an issue if you're looking at somebody as a top 50 pick as opposed to once you get further down. But he's a really, really explosive athlete, and he makes a ton of plays. And I think, I think the question is, where does he fit in a certain defense? But I think he's going to be a big problem. We were talking about, I have Penn State, West Virginia right out of the gate. That has a chance to be a kind of coming out party for him. I think for, again, Gardner Webb guy. It's not like Gardner Webb hasn't had any, I've had a couple of Gardner Webb freaks list guys in the past. But he's one that I think now has a chance to make a splash at that point.
I should have warned you about this question before I asked it, Bruce, but I'm going to go back to last year's freaks list. The Giants have a guy named Elijah Chatman in camp, Baby Bison, and he's listed as 6 feet tall. I've stood next to him with him wearing cleats. Dude ain't 6 feet tall. But I talked to Andre Patterson, who's a longtime NFL defensive line coach, the other day, and he said, keep in mind, this is a room with Dexter Lawrence in it, that Chatman is the strongest guy in his room as a rookie, and he's been flashing all over camp. So I'm going to make you go back, put your thinking cap on to last year. What can you tell me about Elijah Chatman?
Elijah Chatman had, I hate to do this, I feel like I'm guilty because I'm going to do it twice in the podcast, but sometimes you get really short, undersized interior guys, and if they're super explosive and twitchy, they're the poor man's Aaron Donald, right? Or or at least they're the poor man's Kalijah Kancey, and this guy, I think is probably stronger than Kalijah. I mean, and when I talked to people at SMU, they were like, you have to have, this is, it might have been even 2 years ago where he was that way. And it was like, you wonder what he was going to be in the NFL, because you think, okay, he can help in special teams. Is he a guy who somebody would make as like a short yardage fullback because he's so strong and so explosive? Like, there's a lot of stuff you can do with him. I'm not surprised that he has created some buzz with the Giants. I am surprised you said what you just said, because Dexter Lawrence is like 70 or 60 pounds bigger than him.
Legitimately, yes.
Giant compared to him, but I'm not surprised he's created a lot of buzz because he's a pretty special athlete in his own right.
I ask you about the last guy on your list. I'm glad to see him make the list, Brett Gabbert. And if that name sounds familiar to a lot of viewers, yeah, it is the little brother of Blaine Gabbert. I mean, this is a guy, when he's on the field, he shows a lot of skill. He's got a good arm. He's mobile, but the guy just can't stay healthy, can't stay on the field. Went back to Miami of Ohio for another season. Hopefully it works out for him this year.
Yeah, and he had to go back. I mean, so last October, late October, they're 6-1. Toledo is 6-1, and they're playing a game, and he breaks his leg, and it's gruesome. Chuck Martin is the head coach there. He told me, I went out on the field, and it's like a little kid at a horror movie. You're saying, don't look, don't look, don't look. And he goes, I peeked down, and I got nauseous, and I was like, why did I do that? And when they basically gave Gabbert a 12 to 16 month timetable for his recovery.
Wow.
He was like, I'm making it back. This is going to be he's a 6-year guy. This is going to be my last year of college football. I'm making it back for the opener. And so part of why he's on the freaks list is his resilience and toughness to get back. He's already back at practice. He told me he will be the starter when they open. I think the day is like, instead of 12 to 16 months, it's like 315 days from the time he got hurt to that. And Tony, right, because he had a broken collarbone the year before. He missed about half the season. He's not like his brother in terms of like, I remember Blaine was like a lead 11 quarterback. He's big. I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to remember, right? He's probably every bit of 6'4", 220, and he could really run. His brother's probably like 3 inches shorter. And I imagine at some point he will be a coach if he wants to be a coach. And I want to see, like they're a good team, and he's a great leader, and everybody's kind of wowed by his toughness and his unselfishness and all those things. And he told me when he was laying on the ground, he goes, I remember, he was like, I was not worried about me. I'll be fine. I just felt really bad that my family and friends who would all come in to see this game, they were thinking, knowing I was there on a broken leg with the bone sticking out of the skin.
Yeesh. Final question
Yeah.
for me, Bruce, and then I'll let Tony wrap us up here. I like asking you this. It's open-ended, so I apologize for that ahead of time, but no one's more plugged into college football, talks to more people than you do. What's the underrated storyline around college football this year that you don't think enough people are talking about that you think is really going to impact how this year's goes, which obviously is going to impact what happens in the NFL draft?
I don't know if this is exactly where you'd want me to go, but the thing that I think people don't know enough or haven't realized yet is that, this time of year, especially this week, had the AP top 25 come out, and you see the top 10 teams or top 25, but you see that, and you're just conditioned to think, okay, there's going to be a 12-team playoff, and that's how it's going to kind of shape off of whatever the top 25 looks like. And that's probably not going to be the way it is, because you're going to have all the ACC and the Big 12, in addition to the SEC and the Big 10. Those conference champs are going to have automatic buys, and they're going to be the top four seeds. If the Big 12 is what I think it is, you may have a 10-3 champ that's probably not even in the top 8, but they're going to be sitting there at number 4 in the poll. And there will already for sure be one team that makes the 12-team playoff that started the season preseason unranked. And the reason why that is because there are no teams outside the Power 4 in the top 25, preseason top 25. Usually there are a couple that make that somewhere between like 18 and 25. This year there aren't. Well, one of those teams that's not is going to make the playoff. And I just think as people sit there and watch the course of the season, that's going to be really fascinating to see, how many teams are still in play for a playoff spot.
That's a great answer.
One question about the list this year. Did you find that you had more small school players than in the past, same amount or less? When I say small school players, I'm talking about non-FBS schools.
I haven't had a lot in the last couple of years, but I definitely feel like I might have had more. I do. There was a few that it's funny because I did a second day story after Freaks List, and there's a player and because this is like a Giants podcast, I feel like I can say this school. It's like Middlebury College in Vermont. If I do most college football stuff, I don't even think they know where Vermont is, much less where Middlebury is. Right? And Thomas Perry is a offensive lineman who is super strong. Another guy who, by the way, was you'll see a trend here, was a top level high school wrestler. Schools in the New England area did not even recruit him. He went to Middlebury, he's gone there, and he started to get some buzz, like Duke Manyweather, who's great with O-line guys in the process. He's been working with this kid. He had him for like 5 weeks, and his strength numbers are really, really high level. His agility numbers are still good. He's somebody who I was like on the fence on. I probably should have had him on, but I wanted to at least tell his story of his rise. And so I ended up doing like a separate story on him, and there's like 5 other guys who are like kind of like almost on the cut. As you guys had asked me about Gabbert, I definitely wanted to have Gabbert on there this year, and I thought it was a good way to kind of end. It's actually like a story within the Freaks List, but I could have easily done 120 guys, and so I wanted to at least bring some of those other small school guys that I didn't have room for. Like, I mean, we didn't talk about this, but one of the guys on the Freaks List, there's a really, really good offensive tackle from William and Mary.
Yep.
He was 240 pounds out of high school and had William and Mary offered him, and a school in Virginia I'd never heard of was the other school, and he's going to test great, and they really love what they see from this kid, and it's a big deal that he's still there and like didn't get poached by a Power 5 school offering him a ton of money to come play for them.
Grant,
All right.
Charles Grant is the offensive tackle from William and Mary, and he's already graded. He's already projected by scout to be a day 2 prospect. So we'll be seeing him in the postseason, probably at the Senior Bowl.
Day
Yeah,
2. I like it.
yeah, he's definitely one that like everybody loves. He's got good length. I mean, he's not 320 pounds. He's now up to 300. But again, he was 240 in high school.
That's great. Bruce, before we say goodbye here, tell the folks everything else you have going on, where they can find you on Fox, what else you have on The Athletic. And if you want to, you can give a clue as to how difficult it is putting this thing together and how time consuming is. Because I think we all appreciate it when it comes out every year. We talk to you twice. We talk to you now. We talk to you when you have like your little, inside college football mock draft type of thing before the draft. But just tell people what you're doing, where they can find you, and then kind of how you put this thing together every year.
Yeah, it's I spent quite a bit of time on it and a ton of phone calls and texts and everything, but it's a it's something I love working on. I feel like it's the best way for me to get ready for the season. I feel like it's also a great way to spotlight a lot of the guys who come through the Senior Bowl, East West, process to kind of get out in front of it. I mean, I'm grateful to a lot of the scouts and NFL side who have, I can share notes with and kind of talk through some stuff. I mean, it's my favorite thing to do. It's my favorite thing to work on, I should say, in terms of that. And for anybody, it's like just check out the Freaks List. You can find it somewhere on The Athletic or find it on my somewhere on my social media. I've tweeted out a bunch of different links because it's just one of those things where there's like 101 different stories in it. Like there's a ton of guys. Like we can't talk about every single guy in there. We would be doing this for like 3 days, kind of thing. And that's what I love about it because there's just so many different ways that people can find it.
Yeah, and your colleague Dane Brugel's done a good job. He's putting his preseason list out there too. And then Tony, why don't you tell the folks where they can find your preseason stuff as well before we say goodbye here?
Obviously, Sportskeeda going through all the conferences team by team with rating all the NFL prospects. Some guys that are going to be top 100 picks. Some guys that right now grade as undrafted selections, but that will change as we saw with Jaden Daniels last year, who a year ago when we were doing this show, was projected to be a 5th-round pick, ends up as the 2nd pick of the draft.
And that's why they play the games. And Bruce, Fox Sports 1, Fox college football too?
Yeah, big noon. Yeah, I'm on with the Big Noon Kickoff show. Like I said, we have some great games out of the gate. We actually I'm in studio for a week 0 game. We have New Mexico against Montana State. Montana State's a good really good FCS program. So can't wait for the season. The games are almost here.
Bruce, thanks so much. That's your first episode of Draft Season brought to you by Moody's. For Tony, for Bruce, I'm Schmeelk. We'll see you next time, everybody.